He is the director of Open Systems Lab, a non-profit R&D company that develops contemporary technologies to transform housing, planning, construction and development in this 21st century with amazing innovations like WikiHouse, PlanX and Fairhold. He writes and speaks and advises widely on housing, property, planning, digital transformation, and the role of design and innovation in tackling complex social and economic challenges. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Now I feel like there's a pressure on me to make some kind of sense.
Yeah.
Or maybe I'll be obvious. Thank you so much. Such a great pleasure to be here. I want to start by making you kind of do a bit more work, actually. Bring to your mind what you think are the biggest crises and systemic challenges that the UK and that Somerset face at the moment. Like the really big ones, right? The crisis. So obviously things like housing affordability crisis. That's pretty real. Feel free to shout any out. I think we're kind of thinking of any. Flooding. Okay, that's super interesting. Real big. Food, yeah. And the food system, the resilience of the food system in the face of climate shocks that are going to be coming. Frankly, the way in which farming industry, the rural communities are struggling, coastal economies are struggling. But we could go on any number more, right? Loneliness is a huge issue. Care, the squeeze people are experiencing on living, the increasing sense of sort of disenfranchisement among young people, the absolutely, I was about to say something rude then, rubbish, false binary choice between block development and pants unaffordable development. And I saw the signs on the way here about the 200 and whatever it's called homes development that's been created. This kind of rubbish choice between poor quality speculative development versus no development at all. What kind of choice is that, right? Indeed, yeah. On top of that, like the visible decline of neighbourhoods across the UK, and what that's doing is sort of, along with that disenfranchisement of young people who know that they're trapped out of home ownership, which obviously, of course, it does, drives people towards increasing support for the far right. When young people are stuck at home with nothing but what's being fed into social media, etc. Right? So all of these things compound. So the reason I talk about these is that when we talk about land, it can seem really abstract and seem really weird. And yet if you take almost any one of those crises and challenges that we're facing today and start pulling that string into the root causes and drivers, I promise you, at the end of that piece of string, as complex as each of those challenges are, you will find the same thing always waiting at the end of the string, which is our weird dysfunctional legal relationship with places. But we don't talk about it in language that makes sense for that. We separate these things out and we talk about them as separate things. So how many news headlines have you heard dedicated to ideas like energy poverty or food poverty or fuel poverty or mobility poverty? And don't get me wrong, those things are really real. But when you actually look into the lives of families who are facing those hardships, you say, what is your single biggest outgoing every month? Oh, it's rent. So the poorest houses in the UK, poorest households in the UK are routinely now spending 50 to 60% of their income paying rent to a landlord. But that money isn't spent on food. It's not spent on energy. It's not spent on transport. What is it spent on? Those of you who rent, who are renters today, how much of the rent that you spend every month would you say your landlord spends on the house? Right? And to be clear, by the way, and this goes across everything I'm going to say here, none of this is a pejorative about landlords. I used to be a landlord. This is not the point. Most of what you're paying a landlord to do is simply to not evict you. And that's weird, isn't it? right? So, and yet we're talking about fuel poverty and food poverty. So we're missing the elephant in the room, which is, well, wait a minute, the single biggest outgoing, and if you're under 50, almost certainly the single biggest outgoing in your life is your rent or your mortgage payments, right? It's huge, this kind of huge thing. And so, and we can do the same across all of these things. So look at whether it's the challenge of retrofitting our homes or building new development, building new good quality development. What's going wrong? It's this property system and the strange, weird incentive it creates, where those who do have an incentive to create beautiful, affordable, sustainable neighborhoods can't get access to the land. And those who can get access to the land have no incentive to make beautiful, affordable neighborhoods, right? In fact, they have a direct incentive not to. Again, not because they're bad people, because that's how the business model works. And yet we're locked into these systems that make absolutely no sense to anybody, right? So this is kind of weird. Like, how did we end up here? How did that happen? So we have this kind of system that's sitting at the root of this. One of the other kind of problems I always talk about in the way that we talk about this is we talk about this as a housing crisis. And that is in a way misleading because it makes us focus on the housing. Actually, in industrial societies, providing shelter isn't actually the hard part. We could actually provide shelter pretty quickly for the 300,000 or so homeless families in the UK. You know, we could just pop them up in Upper Siberia. Well, that would be no good, right? Actually, the real issue is location. Like, where would we put them all? In industrialized society, what's contentious is how do we organize ourselves in space? And this also speaks to the problem of what is land. What do we mean by land, right? It's not the mud, the soil beneath our feet, as important and as tangible as that is. As we sit here, there is land right beneath our feet. But how is it possible to own that? It's an inherently absurd notion, right? By definition, that land was here before we came and it will be here after we left, right? But it's a sort of a natural, it's just there. So what do we mean even by land? What we really are talking about is a system of ownership. So where did that ownership system come from? Well, there's obviously a long version of this history that arcs through ancient Mesopotamia and through ancient Rome. But broadly speaking, in this country, we can kind of basically date it back to 1066, right? And what I call medieval king problems. You've heard of first world problems. Medieval king problems is a really subset niche of this, which is if you're William the Conqueror and you've just conquered a country, how do you run and you dominate a country? And how do you fund your military campaigns without having a permanent standing army, which is expensive and dangerous because they tend to turn on you historically, and without having a big organized computer-based bureaucracy? And the answer is a piece of paper, right? Is that you basically have your dukes and your lords and you say, right, if you provide troops when I need them, in exchange, I will give you your own private fiefdom. And within that private fiefdom, I give you permission to raise taxes as high as people can bear to pay. Now, that's really, really, really important for two reasons. One is it gives us this kind of moment of realization where we realize rent was the original tax paid by everybody to their feudal lord and ultimately in services to the king, right? And it remains a tax today. It's just that today, over time, because of the power of landowners, the history of power in England, the history of power in Britain is the history of land ownership, right? And the contestation of the power of landowners. And today, of course, we those taxation rights, those pieces of paper that give it essentially privatized, right? You can buy and sell those taxation rights. But the fact remains that as a rich person, I can buy the right to essentially tax somebody about 50% of their income for no service other than simply the fact that I had enough money to be able to do it in the first place and they didn't have enough money. That's really weird, right? We have this, it's like this, nobody agrees with this. Right? No, you will not hear an argument for this from the political left or the political right. Like you will not hear someone saying, "Oh yeah, I believe in kind of free markets and competition." No, there are no free markets there. equally, of course, yeah, the left aren't going to argue for that, are they, either, right? So it's this weird thing that persists. It's this weird leftover of the feudal system that we never managed to get rid of. It just stayed there like this buggy piece of code in our operating system. And the reason it persists isn't because anybody can really defend it, but rather because of vested interest, right? We all have some form of vested interest, even if some more than others, right? But even if you have a pension, for example, your pension is to some extent vested into this system. And the other thing to remind ourselves, of course, is that this is it is a system, right? So what it tells us is that land ownership is really about power. It's a power relationship that one person can have over other people, right? And actually the power is probably more important in some ways than the physical home. I will often say to people, if you had a choice between having a large luxury house that you have to pay rent on for the rest of your life and you could be evicted from at any time, versus a small plot of land with a ramshackle shed on it, but it's yours forever and you have security and you can improve that building anytime you've got the ability to do so, which would you choose? Right? It is fundamentally about power. Housing policy wonks don't talk about it like that, but when you have conversations with anybody who's at the rough end of this system, listen to the language they will use. They will rage against the blatant indignity of the system. This blatant hypocrisy that we tell ourselves we live in a democratic society, and yet the primary economic transfer of wealth, the primary economic thing that's going on every month is a massive transfer of wealth from poor people to rich people. Right? It completely exposes or confronts our own idea of ourselves as a prosperous or as an entrepreneurial or as a caring society, and as does, of course, the incentives that it creates. So this is why, effectively, what you can kind of fast forward, take that system, fast forward it through several hundred years of history. Sorry, as a kind of Christmas cracker, skipped all the way through the enclosure movements and the Reform Acts, etc. Pile a huge amount of financial debt into this system where people are then allowed to effectively, you can buy your freedom, you can buy your way out of this feudal system, but by the way, you're going to have to rent money to do it. And so then allow huge amounts of debt to pour into that additional system. So, of course, remember, the price of land is based on what you can bear to pay. So when you can borrow more, you can spend more. And that's why we saw this massive inflation in house prices through the 90s and 2000s as debt poured into this system. But we always were just trying to mitigate it. But this is effectively where you arrive at, is this essential dilemma. And this is why governments are seemingly so ineffectual at dealing with this, is that today, those pieces of paper, those privatized taxation rights, they account for 80% of the total value of UK's wealth, right? So all the factories, all the shares, all the gold, all the data, they look puny by comparison. This is not just the biggest game in town; it's almost the entire game, right? And we don't really talk about that. Right, there's this huge. We always scratch our heads and go, "Where will we find the money to do X, to do this?" Well, it's all there under our feet, but we're allowing it to still be captured into this weird leftover legacy of the feudal system that nobody agrees with. And so this is the dilemma. This is why governments find this really, really hard to deal with, because at its heart, everything comes down to one simple truth, which is we can either see land as two things. Which is, we can see land as a financial asset, or we can see land as a social, if you like, a platform, right? Or the essential social infrastructure. It cannot be both, because land as a good financial asset, you want that to cost as much as possible. Whereas land as social infrastructure, you want it to cost as little as possible, in the same way that you want water and electricity and other things to cost as little as possible. Of course, there's a whole other third view, which is also important, which is land as a community stewardship responsibility, right? Which is, I don't mean to make light of that. I'm focusing on the economics. But it cannot be both of these things at once. And this is exactly what most government policies are trying to pull off. They're trying to somehow make housing affordable whilst not making it go down in price. And so this is the problem, right? Is that actually, how do we solve this? I've been a bit doom and gloom, right? So we're trapped in this kind of weird legacy system. How do we change this? Well, weirdly, there are actually solutions for this. And probably the big go-to solution is the idea of land value tax. So the idea of shifting from seeing land as simply this pure thing that you own purely as right, and you have the ability to charge people rents and do what you like out, to the idea of effectively, instead of taxing people's incomes, you tax their use of land, essentially like a community ground rent. So you can own a piece of land, but you pay for it continuously. And that's used and this was the idea put forward by Henry George and many others, actually, huge diversity of people, from Winston Churchill to Martin Luther King, Elizabeth McGee, who was the lady who invented what became the game of Monopoly. So huge, like this huge kind of very simple idea of saying, well, actually, instead of taxing people's incomes, let's tax land, because remember, that's the tax we pay anyway, right? So let's unprivatize those feudal taxation rights and move back to a sensible world where, since the value of a location is driven by essentially the community, by nature, by the community. So, for example, if you live in the catchment area of an excellent school, it adds something like £50,000 to £80,000 to the value of your home. How much of that money finds its way back to the schools? Right? So this is this problem of this broken system. So a land value tax would solve that. Woohoo! And this is a slogan, but this is a hashtag online, by the way, is land value tax would solve this. But there's a problem, right? Which is, if any of you in this room are a property owner, I won't ask you to do it. But if I said, put your hands up, if you'd like housing to be more affordable, you would all put your hands up. And now put your hands up if you'd like your house to go down in value. Right, well, there's some of you very brave, committed, great props to you, right? But then this is why it's this impossible sell for politicians. So as Jess promised, we wouldn't come on to solutions, thank you, today. But for me, yeah, this is at least the thing that begins to set up the problem and open up a conversation about what the solutions are. And I personally think that we are simply not going to be able to achieve and be ready for the challenges of the 21st century and to realize the promise of looking after ourselves, dealing with these climate shocks, dealing with AI, etc., right? Unless we address this root dysfunction at the heart of our system. But I don't think we're going to be able to do it just by fighting against the old one. Trying to force through land value tax through Westminster honestly, it would make kind of the Brexit debate look like a picnic by comparison, right? I think the way we're going to do it is by buying out the old system. The new world essentially buying out the old system. So effectively, how can we begin to move to a future where communities simply start buying the land? Because if all the power was vested in landowners, then let's let communities become the landowners. Community puts buying land into the community and then putting it into trust is effectively like the equivalent in our current legal setup, essentially the closest we've got to letting the land own itself. And the power of this move is incredible, because even though it might seem so difficult and so daunting to do, the incredible power of it is that it only needs to ever be done once, right? Land only ever needs to be bought out once, and then it's bought out forever for everyone who ever lives there now and in the future. And that's huge, right? The paradox of this is it begins in very local, everyday ways. Communities battling to get their hands onto to buy these pieces of land. And yet what they're actually achieving when they can do this, it's not hubristic to call it the abolition of feudalism. That's what it finally is. To finally move from a society that could truly call itself a democratic society, because we've actually finally got rid of that kind of buggy feudal code. And I think that now there's whole lots of conversations we can have about what are the mechanisms in planning, what are the new kind of institutions, what are the new kind of financial structures. One of the things we're working on, Fairhold, the idea of, well, once the community owns that land, what can you do with it? So the idea of fairhold is building on an idea that's already been pioneered by community land trusts, which is they can then lease that land in the form of a home ownership lease that would allow you to own a home for less, but only as a place to live, not as a financial asset. We could make that normal. That's a form of affordable home ownership that could be made available to, frankly, anybody who wants it in the UK. If we can create these institutions and really set ourselves to this problem of how we're going to do that. But we should see it. We should see that struggle both as a very real rooted thing that we can do in terms of the legacy of the places where we live, but also as part of a big, big historical arc. And I think as the old system continues to collapse, continues to disenfranchise people, these small islands of the future are going to become like lifeboats, little lifeboats of abundance, where we can build and practice and propagate a new land economy.
On my far left, Nadia Shaikh is a land justice campaigner, co-director of Right to Roam, where she's working to reclaim our rights to be on the land across England. She's an inspiration to people all over the country in this work. Nadia's mission lies in fighting against a human disconnect from nature and from the land by advocating for and exposing the truth about land ownership, as we've begun to hear about from Alastair, as well as all the environmental justices that follow from that. Beyond this, she's also works in nurturing and leading the Raven Network, which is a radical anti-racist and decolonial support group within the nature conservation sector. And she's co-host of the very brilliant Into the Wild podcast. Next to Nadia, Imi Kaur is one of my favourite people in the world. Sorry, everybody else. She makes me think and laugh and be angry all at once, but with some kind of glee that also makes me want to keep going and push on no matter what we face. Imi is co-founder and director of the extraordinary Civic Square in Birmingham. It's an incredible organisation that's demonstrating a kind of neighbourhood scale civic infrastructure ready for social and ecological transition. And together with 1 million people, I think everyone in Ladywood in Birmingham, they're reimagining land stewardship, finance, governance, and with a particular focus around ecological building design and bio-based materials, something very close to people's hearts here. Imi is an active member of Project 00, a collaborative studio based in London, as well as part of the Donor Economics Action Lab advisory team and the Commonwealth Advisory Board. So she got something to say. And of course, Alastair, also here, joining us again for the panel. So before we kick off, I just want to acknowledge this extraordinary artwork that you are all sitting in front of, a stained glass work by the incredible Pinky McClure, who we're very, very proud to have her work on show here. I'm guessing it's the first time any of you have done a panel while being pissed on by a activist gardener above your heads. So just to humble everyone a little, it's not a tree. We had some teenagers in the other day who were like, "Is that a tree?" And we were like, no, it's not a tree. Anyway. So before we move headlong into some of these questions around systems that Alastair has introduced, I thought I would ask each of you perhaps to begin with a slightly more simple question and just tell us a little bit about your own personal inflection points into the land question. When did you realise land mattered so much? What was it that gave you that indication, if not just Alastair telling you? I imagine this might be the last word I get, but we'll start with that. Nadia, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So, God, that's a hard and simple question. I guess the roots of my relationship with working with land and responding to the land question and the land problem is like being a young naturalist and from a very young age understanding that like wild things are interesting things and human things are weird things. So my roots are around like being very young, I come from quite a complicated background with lots of trauma and lots of problematic family dynamics. Adults never made sense, but like birds and tadpoles made sense. So naturally, having a relationship with the natural world stuck with me until I started working in nature conservation, which I did for many years in various roles as ecologist and surveyor, ornithologist, and getting deeply embedded in the nature conservation sector. And the curiosity of like, how can we be a nation of animal lovers, have like myriad environmental NGO organizations, but have some of the worst biodiversity in the world? And these questions never quite left me. And then the more senior that I got within the sector and the more questions that I started to ask, I was like, why is it these questions are now not getting answered? There was a point at which I was an interesting person in my career that could elevate. And then there was a point in which I felt like I started becoming a problem because I was asking questions of, hang on a minute, the reason why curlew are declining, the reason why these things are happening is because the people that own that land are allowing it to happen ultimately. So why don't we go straight to the landowners and look at ecological systems and repair? Who is killing these birds? What is happening? And I recognized there was like a blockage. The conservation sector was like, oh no, that's not what we do. You know, we recruit members, get money, buy habitat. And I was like, I don't think we can buy habitat out of, we can't buy more land to get out of this problem. And I think that's when I started to understand land ownership as an issue, even within the sector, that they didn't want to talk about it. It's often, you've probably found this, when someone stops wanting to answer your questions, that's where you've found the sweet spot, you've found the issue. And from what was quite an exciting and once nurturing environment to belong in within the nature conservation sector, it started to feel quite dark and problematic with its approach in saving nature, which wasn't being saved and isn't being saved. And then I guess just got involved with land ownership, as simple as that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Imi, how did you end up on this stage?
Well, thank you for that lovely intro, and it's really lovely to be here. Thank you, everyone. I guess sort of like three sort of pivotal moments. One is that I am second generation, but my parents like basically grew up in India up until the age of 15. But my grandparents came here post partition, and in India, and that journey really, and their histories and the way in which they described their lives, and what had happened in the period from their like childhoods to moving to the UK, gave me like a young and quite embodied experience of what it means to be like displaced from your land, what it means to have this thing that Alastair taught me really, really clearly, the difference between the soil and natural matter under your feet, which we sometimes conflate with land, and how I understood the system of land being the papers and the stories that we as humans make to relate with that land. It was like this very, very clear and deep understanding of the kind of horrors of what is possible when humans subjugate, control, displace, and so on and so on. But it was in a way that was like embodied. It was only when I was much older I could tell the story, I could understand the story backwards. So that was one really, really clear moment in the histories of my generation of racialized folks who have been moved or displaced or left their homelands to end up in the UK. And there was a lot of us who were starting to realize this about 15 years ago. And for me, that moment was meeting Alastair and Indy Johar from Now Dark Matter Labs. But at that time, 00, this party of people rethinking the systems and stories and codes and ideas that gently and also violently shape our places. Quite young, when we were setting up something called the Impact Hub, I remember them both being incredibly nurturing and encouraging, and Indy being his very like typical self of being like, you should do this because you need to learn why this is not going to work. Okay. And so we took on this 5-year lease of this space called the Impact Hub, fitted and built it out in beautiful ways, which you can really imagine because you get to come here lots. And it was incredible, and we crowdfunded, and we had this young people's movement who built this space. But they're absolutely right. It was thriving. It raised loads of revenue. It was wonderful. But the private landowner extracted all of the financial and or other value, and the local area benefited from all of our work, of which we were always just going to be tenants. It was still very worth doing, because it taught me this very, very clear thing at a younger age, that it isn't just if we keep trying to do more and more and more and more as communities, at some point, some community somewhere in Watchet or on that high street or in that corner or that tool library or that hub, they'll finally crack it and it'll be okay. This was like this second visceral and embodied experience, that it isn't just that we have to keep doing more and more. And the more one group finally cracks that magic, the country will realise. That won't be the case in rules and stories actively set up. Sometimes by accident, sometimes more glitch in the code, sometimes more violently and explicitly, that we have to build. The task of our generation would be to like work in that code, and that's what we really needed to do. So this was the second bit. And then really, really practically, I guess, I'm saying this because I just always feel like it's really important to name this. For me, I've never really had to feel like I need to know the whole story, right? Because I've grown up and worked in the kind of alongside so many thinkers and doers and people hacking at different parts of the system all over the place. And so really being able to link that practice and the everyday of our organising and our imaginations and the creativity to folks who spend their lives really thinking about so much of this, as well as building, has been fundamental. And I'm going to talk about that a lot, right? Because I think that there's so much individualization made about how we are going to do this. And I don't think that this is everyone fighting on their own. I personally think there is a burgeoning movement, and it needs to be able to connect up the stories. And so in the urban context of Birmingham, it's then also just everywhere, right? We're now at the arse end of any of this really working. The city, you come to Birmingham, it is unbelievable. The sort of final nails of the coffin that started a long time ago can be traced back to many different histories. If you want to put Thatcher as the point, if you want to put feudalism as the point, if you want to put austerity at the point, but you cannot walk around Birmingham or many urban inner cities now and not viscerally see the story of the 20th century falling apart live in front of your eyes. And yet, somehow, the communities most and the people with most vested interest to build glorious, beautiful, generative, caring places have least access to even get like the dilapidated shop front on the high street that's been empty for 20 years. It is still impossible. And so this story has both radicalized and inspired me and driven much of the work that we are trying to do.
Thank you. Alastair, did you want to say anything about your personal, he started as an architect, don't hold it against him.
Yeah, you basically summed up. An important thing, by the way, on your these things was the Civic, that kind of moment where Civic Square, you got the piece of land right. Because this is well, I'm sure we can come back to this, is a classic dilemma of community come in and create some value, but then the private landowners are the ones who then get to extract it. And so actually is why it's kind of making community ownership a kind of precursor 100%. So that value comes full circle again.
And if you are like a real nerd about this, if after today you are super radicalized by this, a piece of work that Dark Matter Labs did with the Centre for Spatial Technologies that was around the time that Alastair was doing a lot of the anew land contract work, which I could share links to all of these things, is a piece of work called the Smart Commons. Yeah. I'll talk about it later, but fundamentally lays this out in a way that once you see it, you can't unsee it, and you will never, ever pursue anything else other than the generational buyout.
Yeah. I feel like you better just talk about it now.
Okay. Are you
No, it's okay. We can come back to that.
Yeah, all right, come back to it. Okay, so this was in 2019. It's a beautiful blog. It's still there.
Yeah.
It is not the thing you should read first. Okay, be really, really clear. But if you've got an afternoon and you're like, I'm in for this, we did a conversation called The New Land Contract in 2020. It's on YouTube. I'll share the links with Jess. She can share it. Watch that and then read this piece. This piece does an analysis on the New York High Line. So this piece of social and tourist, sort of beautiful, stunning infrastructure that got built in the middle of New York. And we know this story that I'm about to tell, but it laid it out in numbers and figures. Right. And so you build the High Line, it's stunning. If you get to go to New York and you get to have that one moment, you go up the High Line, you take your photos, you're like, oh my God, you forget about gentrification for a minute and you're like, this is beautiful. And basically they analysed the story of the High Line, who funded it, and the way in which this story of value is captured. Right. And this is like, it's just accepted as normal. But basically,
and the key point here is, right, it cost several, 100 million to do this project, but the land value uplift they calculated in the surrounding of area of Manhattan is into the billions.
Billions, right? But who paid for that hundreds of millions? Who paid for that hundreds of millions was New York City, right? So they paid for it. So the public pocket paid for it, and the value was captured within 100 meters, half a mile around the High Line by private property owners. And so this piece it was a really interesting one, right? Because it's where I think Dark Matter Labs and Alastair sit in an interesting nexus. Because I come from the kind of tear it down, land justice, colonization movement, right? And then these guys are here with we've got some answers that could potentially work in the UK on this, right? So they'd framed this piece really interestingly, not as a oh my God, look what's happening, but as a way that would be this just doesn't make any sense. We can predict this, that the public purse is often paying for and never being able to recoup the value that is created. But interestingly, the same is also true when then disasters and problems strike, because it's actually the public purse that pays for it, but they never were able to ever capture the value. So this was a hypothesis.
And this is why we won't be able to tackle any of these things until we fix the land thing. So to take an obvious popular one, people talk, oh, AI is going to come along. Yeah. What we'll do, oh, it's fine, we'll give everyone basic universal income. But if we gave everyone basic universal income next month at £1,000 a month, guess what would happen? The rents would just go up by £1,000 a month. So we cannot deal with the resilience issues related to almost anything without tackling this underlying dysfunction, right? Yeah. So but the same thing goes for this public investment thing. It's truly whether it's public money or communities coming together to invest that, here, right? There's loads of people who dedicated hours and things like time and dedication. Actually, it's fundamentally problematic to do that if at the same time there's a bunch of people then extracting that money out of the neighborhood.
Yep. And I'll just finish. And so basically, then it was what we need to be able to do. And this was a bit more of a solutionist space where it was we can predict this is happening everywhere, right? So we need to find ways to rewire that value. Now, they had put quite a bit of a technical solution on this. And I both agree with that, but I also think there's quite a justice space here, because there are a lot of vested interests in that not happening, because it's basically how things are set up as normal. But once you start to see this, you can build together a picture of what I think is a psychotic way. It's like a psychosis. How would you run an economy like this? It makes absolutely no sense. And now we can see it's breaking at every level. And we'll come back to this resilience piece, because that's what the work is at Civic Square. But I really want to hear from other folks first. Is this is the story, right? We literally need to point out how absurd this is, how it is not going to build resilience, how it is not going to help us to tackle anything, and it is by design. And so these pieces of work were really seminal for me. They were it was the embodied meets what you can see meets the thinking and the data. And I think we have that triad now. I think we can explain and describe this problem in 1,000 ways, but I think this generation has to come together to start to demonstrate and build alternatives and start hacking away at it in really, really smart and resistive ways, as well as really propositional ways as well. So anyway, I share all the links. So if you get really into this, this is the place that I would go next, because it's really thoughtful.
Stop the reach.
No, you won't be back in 20 minutes, right?
I mean, like, I think in similar vein, the different, you're looking at like our environmental problem, like our current systems for tackling biodiversity, and environmental issues, they're just simply not working. When it comes to land ownership, we pay landowners to look after wildlife or restore ecosystems. There are accounts of like estates where the public purse has paid 3 times what they paid for the land back to the landowner over the course of their ownership, where they'll get paid to intensively farm the land. Then new subsidies will come in, and then they're paid to like rewild and green the land. And that's as long as they get to decide to do it. And actually, that's not how ecosystems work, and that's just not what nature needs in terms of like what we're paying for to like farmer subsidies or whatever it is. It's just, unless it's owned by us and we decide how we want to caretake and have a relationship with nature, it's just never going to be sustainable. This like constant investment into restoring nature rather than stopping people fucking up in the first place. It's just going to just keep going down the pan, which is, there's lots of like terminology around like nature solutions and like trying to like find the value of nature back to us, so like clean waterways or clean air, like how much is a reed bed worth, so that we can have clean water or whatever that might be. And if we keep looking at it also as a value system, like who is that benefiting? It's just those the kind of like money cycles run out, and everything is plummeting in terms of environmental benefits back to ultimately, if we are to survive, obviously we need our environment to survive as well. So yeah.
Do you want to talk about architecture, or should we slide past you?
I'll do it really briefly, but my way into this in a way was completely unpersonal to begin with. In the sense that I was just being a designer. So I studied architecture, and I then went to architecture school, and part of the way architecture education works, you then go out and you work in an architecture office. I was incredibly lucky to go and work for a quite well-known architect called Richard Rogers. And this was during the boom time, right? So this is like 2006. There was so much money flooding through the system. You think everyone would be really happy. And yet when I meet up with my friends in the pub, they'd be all like, oh God, I hate it. My client keeps making me make the ceilings lower and put less insulation in the walls and take the balconies off. And a lot of people left architecture at that point because they got so disenfranchised with this fact that they thought they were going to design these beautiful, sustainable buildings that made the world better. And instead they were doing this. And I was like, guys, they can realize this is fascinating. It means we don't understand the economics of our own kind of environment, the system that we're part of. And so it's the classic, just like you start pulling a string and you say, well, wait a minute, why do we have housing? Why are all these rubbish incentives in place where we all agree that we want certain, say, more well-insulated homes, and yet the exact structural incentives are in the wrong direction? So at a certain point as a designer, you realize, oh, wait, it's the design of the system. Okay, whose job is it to redesign that? Anyone? Anyone? And I just realized, as a designer, we're not going to be able to do this one building at a time. We're going to have to try and redesign those systems. And so came into that. So, and of course, exactly as you perfectly put it, once you see it, you can't unsee it. So sorry.
Yeah.
A lot of people probably already red pill.
It's a real problem, isn't it? Because once you see it,
once you've taken the red pill, that's it.
But I think there's a really interesting moment, because I joined 00 at the nexus of a really interesting moment in this work, where if you look up WikiHouse, it's incredible. Alastair's very humble, but there's this beautiful open source global network of Lego for houses that community can build, and they're stunning, and they're zero carbon, and they're wow. And I came in at this moment where everybody was having this like kind of profound realization, and you were starting to really tell these stories, particularly because you could at that time build a pretty stunning wiki house made by the community with local materials, upskilling, doing the kind of good old, like the community gets together and builds something. It was beautiful. And then I always remember this diagram of like the wiki house costs, say, like 60 grand. And everyone's like on the front page of The Guardian.
So, wow, I'll get a house for 60 grand.
House for 60 grand, wiki house, and like, all of this, and it was amazing, and like there was TED Talks and everything, but the real story was actually the house might cost you that much, and Indy would talk about at the time it's a depreciating asset. So it's something that is always losing value because you need to fix it and so on. It's the land underneath. Yeah. So you put it in a field in Wales or you put it in the middle of Birmingham, the land underneath will change, but you could, it wasn't fundamentally just the millimeter precise, beautiful technology. It was all the other layers. And so you...
Part of the value, one of the things we love about WikiHouse is that this whole thing is really hard to talk about. You touched on this, invisibility of these systems, right? Talking about land and property is like two fish trying to have a conversation about water. Do you know what I mean, right? That we're so enmeshed in this thing that it's been deliberately made invisible. Plus, exactly as you were talking, the moment you actually hit this issue, there's a whole load of people who start, well, let's not talk about that, right? Yeah. Yeah. So it's really difficult to talk about. The cool thing was, the moment we showed people WikiHouse, the first thing everyone says is, hey, wait a minute, why can't I buy a plot of land? Yeah. Right. So suddenly it kind of flips the narrative. Yeah. But to speak to also to the point about that invisibility thing, even to me, it was weirdly invisible because I said at the beginning of my answer, oh, this wasn't personal. I'd been working on this for a problematic number of years before the penny finally dropped that my own entire ability to work on this was based on the injustice of the land system, right? Because I realized I'd grown up in a middle-class family where my parents had been able to buy a house for like 8,000 quid or something stupid, right? And it had gone up in value. My grandfather had owned a house in North London and it had done the same thing. He then sold it and each of his grandkids got a little inheritance, right? In the meantime, by the way, I got a scholarship to go to a fancy school. I later discovered that scholarship was funded because the school owns a street in London. How monopoly is that? Right. So I got this private education that was funded by a street in London.
I'm on it. Just take it.
It became very personal.
Branding now. Use the bit of the inheritance to say buy a house in Sheffield, realise that I could rent the room, do it up, rent the rooms out to my friends. They got cheap rent. I got a free house bought for me by my friends, basically. Completely unfair. What a completely unfair system. But I realised the result was I'd have been able to graduate without much student debt, etc., and that then enabled me to take much more risks. Thanks to this amazing network, Project 00, Indy, and Immunoisco. But to be able to take this risk to actually work on this work. But I've been working on it for a good 3 years before that penny dropped. That's how invisible this system is.
Yeah. I guess, Nadia, does the same apply to your kind of work around right to roam? So this system where we've parceled everything up and put it into ownership, at some point becomes obvious to you that it's not just about who owns the land, but whether we're even allowed to be on it in any kind of way.
It's the wildest thing,
isn't it?
I've been campaigning with Right to Roam for 5 years now, and I still don't think I've nailed a way of talking about how wild it is that the injustice of that we can't even walk on land, and nobody's crying out for it. And funnily enough, like if ever I do give a talk, people are like, "So why are you just asking to walk on it? Why can't we have it back? If a third of England is still owned by the aristocracy, why are you just asking for land access? Like why can't?" So people are quite easily sometimes catapulted into when you have like a good hour to have a talk and you can be like, what you were laying out at the beginning, like, there's a film coming out like next month that we're in, and there's one guy in it, Francis Fulford, you might have heard of him. His lineage goes back 900 years to the Palace of William the Conqueror. That's who I'm on stage with next month, arguing about land access with. And it's just, you get this time and then people are like, oh yeah, that's really wrong. But just the majority of the population for so many complex reasons around like place, belonging, being allowed to be here, recognizing that being outdoors in a green space is a positive thing and not a negative thing. And for a lot of people, it is a negative thing. If you've had no positive feedback and you know it's not your land to be on, how can you even have an enjoyable walk if it's not been part of your like, yeah, if any minute, you know, like you couldn't just sit down and have a picnic and like stare at a bumblebee because can I? Like, though you have to be properly vulnerable to really have, you know, those amazing days in nature. You have to be appropriately vulnerable to really get that incredible experience from it. But where are all those third spaces in the outdoors? So yeah, you know, but pulled on that, and now it's just like, how do I get this? All of these people in this country to be like, oh, you realize that it's only a offence. We can all just go on the land, right? It's not a criminal offence, and we're so unable to just go out. And that's one of the reasons why Scotland has got the Land Reform Act in 2003 is because prior to 2003, Scotland's law of trespass and property ownership, right to exclude, was the same as England. Scottish people just behaved differently. They did it anyway. There was a sense of
enforceable
belonging.
I'm Scottish, you can't take me away from the land. This is my land. And so it was almost like a customary law anyway, and then it was enshrined in law because more foreign landowners were buying estates in Scotland, putting up signs. The Scottish people were like, whoa, that's not how we do this here. We need to enshrine this in law quick. Whereas in England, it's us that maintain the core by being unwilling to trespass, or fear of trespass. We could all just go out tomorrow and they would literally have.
One of the things you realise when you look in the history of in land and politics in the UK is, so without wishing to be too geeky, the phrase that's often used, but what is land ownership? And the phrase that's often used in legal circles is the concept of a bundle of rights. Right, so it's the idea of that piece of paper and you've got a bunch of rights. Now, of course, in a functioning system, it should technically be a bundle of rights and obligations, right? There should be a series of stewardship obligations that come with it. Interestingly, to your point, a lot of people, even though they're not written in the legal code, they feel those. They feel it's a sense of natural justice, which is why even aristocrats will sometimes say, oh no, I couldn't possibly sell my old house because I feel like, and they drive around in an old banged out Volvo to look after it, right? So, I haven't got anyone with Volvo, so go. I had a Volvo. But you take this kind of bundle of rights. But what's interesting is that over history, exactly what's in that bundle has been contested. So you go back all the way back to 1066, and those rights are total to the point where the landowner even is the magistrate, right? So even has the power to imprison you. And so And when you look back into the history of, for example, the Reform Acts, you realise that fundamentally that was about breaking the grip of landowners. That's why, for example, we have the House of Commoners, the House of Commons and the House of Landlords, right? The whole of power in the UK is structured around land ownership, and it always has been. Obviously, the Enclosure Acts and all of these things. So there's this really, like, for example, again, in the Reform Acts, one of the Reform Acts removed the power of your landlord to see how you were voting, right? So that was what led to the idea of blind ballots, right? Because up until that point, landlords could see who you voted for, and guess what? If you voted for the wrong person, you'd be evicted the next day, right? Surprise, surprise. So it's all about the power of landlords. As you say, one ultimate shortcut, and as I've argued, like, that long game is just to break out this idea that land, being naturally and obviously a common inheritance, should be owned by a single person, and put it into something where it's sort of self-owning trust. But in the meantime, we need to be continuously having that conversation about saying, well, wait a minute, as a landowner, why do you have the right to do that and not an obligation to do that, whether, and there's the right to exclude.
I think that, and that's why, it's a campaign that, like, there's a million things that I could campaign for, but the reason why I'm pinning it to this is because it is one piece, ultimately, hopefully, that shifts that in the right direction. If people can see it and access it, yes, it's not necessarily getting the land back, but if you can't even be on it, I don't know how. My personal opinion is I don't know how we can break all of the other systems. Like, you just have to chip away. And I think ultimately, forming relationships and recognizing that, in this modern day and age, we can challenge those bundle of rights and, like, remove the right to exclude. And then we'll see how much more crumbles after the fact.
And I think that what you just said there is a really good segue into something I kind of wanted to share in the like, so what, right? So we keep talking about it. What does it mean in now's context? And I first and foremost really believe in this, that there has to be many different entry points and many different hacking away at different parts, whether it's like the kind of energy you need to sole focus on a single piece of legislation and get it overturned, and the attention of detail, the sort of type of people you'd be working with, the sort of razor sharp, like kind of almost goal orientated focus you need to have is a critical one. And a great collaborator of ours is Nkem Ndefo, and she often talks about this idea of like knowing when it's time to fight and tear down, knowing when it's time to build up, knowing when you're like trying to work on a very specific thing that you're overturning, and like 1,000,001 possibilities, because I know I observe it all the time in the Right to Roam movement as well, is like 1,000,001 things could take your attention. And like staying razor sharp on like our role within this system is that at this moment is to get that piece of legislation overturned, or like, you know, Alastair often has these like razor sharp details that I often don't understand, but I'm fully supportive of them in like, you know,
You're wrong.
in like tenure, the Fairhold work, or like a piece of tech in planning. And so I do think it's important to know that there are many entry points in. I think that it's a system that has many symptoms, but comes back down to this fundamental. And if Alastair had all day, he could tell you about how everything we experience, from loneliness to lack of biodiversity to poor quality homes to terrible insulation to damp to black mold to all of this, can be followed back to this simple, like, well, not simple, incredibly difficult story around land. And so I'm often like, you know, what does it mean to come to East Quay and say yes to this invitation? Because you know, I actually don't really go many places to talk about land, but what does it kind of mean in the connection to work? And I think that's what really brings Jess and I together in quite a particular and practical way. Because yes, it is true that, you know, beautiful buildings made with natural materials, with resources local to you, returning to the crafts and artisans and the people of that place, and everybody having a stake in it is a stunning and important vision. And here in this part of the country, you understand this and embody it in ways that have been severed violently in, you know, where I'm from, right? So there's still a deeper connection. I can see a wonderful collaborator in the back, Jeffrey, the natural builder, who you can't say his name without saying that whole bit. You know, who's a great example of people that we've been really lucky to work with from this region, to understand what these ideas that are inherent to the culture and histories of places like this mean in the urban context. But actually, like, what is it all for as well, right? Like in this time. And I think connecting right back to what you guys started with this kind of incredible escalating and entangled set of crises, planetary, climate, social, ecological, as well as all of the incredible bundles of inspiration and opportunities connected to them, right? For every crisis, there's a vision of a world that could be very different. But all of this is leading to like a by design story where we will not be able to meet the challenges of the coming centuries. We've done it, and like I said, again, if you get really interested in this, we've done a piece of work called 3-degree neighborhoods that you could kind of supplant into any place and change the data. It tells you a bit of a story of the interlocking and interwoven set of challenges we will face, that we already are, but will face increasingly over the coming century. And we are, the climate science and all of the work of people at the National Emergency Briefing and all of these people is showing that we have hit some points that even if we do everything, it's going to take a generation or two of work to bring us back, right? And we can't precisely predict exactly what that's going to look like. And we know a lot of the information that we are receiving is also not entirely presented impartially. And so you can kind of get to this point of complete kind of, what on earth do we do? And that's why I think places like East Key is so critical. Not just the spaces and places that we're going to be building, like what we're now doing at Civic Square with a large industrial site. But places like this become critical, right? Because for the rest of this generation, in the next coming decades, they become these sites where people are connected, where mutual aid can flow, where systems of both support and survival and mutual aid can meet inspiration and proposition and what could be, where you start to have anchors of places that have been going for long enough. So if you did decide, let's buy out as much of the housing and watch it over the next 20 years and put it into a community land trust, there's an anchor. Because as much as anybody, like, as much as there's like a whole, like, I have to do this thing. I mean, take it from people who are the people doing the things. You don't want to be doing any of this alone. It is broken. We are broken, burnt out, exhausted, right? There is a role in these places having a story. And so to finish on this is what we're trying to do in Birmingham. But what I think it represents is a bigger story. And this story, I think, is going to be both critical to our survival and critical to our regeneration of possibility for future generations in the belly of the imperial colonial beast. We've got to remember that, right? It's going to need a leap of imagination to take this story to another place in the place that birthed the story of land subjugation and extraction. And so just to finish, I want to say, like, I think what brings us together is that there is this movement of people, right? They're working in place, often at the scale of the home, street, neighborhood, town. They work in different ways, right? But with the neighbors and communities that live in those places at the heart of them. They particularly understand the role of civic and social infrastructure, particularly physical, especially in the wake of austerity, because this is the thing that's been taken and stripped away from all of us. Any space where we can build our connection, our care, our collective resilience, our spaces to gather have been ripped away by design, defunded, pulled away. And what I think is emerging, and I don't think this is everywhere yet, but I think it's going to be critical to the stories of places that are being built or are built. And there's many other incredible examples. I can see Tim from Wessex here. There's incredible work. What I think they are starting to do is think about what climate and community resilience looks like now and in the future with honesty. I think that's really important, looking the problem straight in the face so you can raise commensurate to them, not pretending they don't exist. But I think they're looking at them in ways that are imaginative and tangible. So I wouldn't be surprised if East Key and Watch It in a few years' time, by force and by design, ends up becoming a beacon for what coastal community climate resilience looks like, and what happens when communities start to own the story around, let's buy up Watch It then, put it into a trust. Let's make sure in perpetuity is affordable and it's always, and so on and so on. And so I think that's where this land property infrastructure story starts to become really interesting, and where communities actually can really believe that we can do this boldly and not just be in this story of like everything is just going to get worse and some magic silver bullet is going to come and solve it, because it's not, right? It's all of us.
Yeah, thank you, Imi. We were talking. See, told you. We were talking about this last night. I know we said we wouldn't do solutions, but we were talking about there being this kind of inflection point of impending doom, but everything's getting worse, social collapse, ecological collapse. And there being this point at which the kind of opportunity that you talked about, Alastair, exists for communities to actually be able to essentially do community land banking in some way. And so I wonder if it would be useful in terms of understanding how we get to the route that Imi's talking about. If you could just talk a little bit about how you see that might work in this context where we haven't all got millions of pounds in our pockets to buy up sites.
And you said, I hope you remember saying, you said a really interesting thing about site, which I love, which is this thing of this, the phase we're in has this weird glasnosti element to it, where a lot of people in these old institutions are in this weird kind of denial, this kind of inhabited cognitive dissonance, where you talked about the honesty thing, where we can't quite be honest. The thing about these places like this, right, they're these They're wonderful, but what's weird is they're not weird. They're not alternatives. They're outbreaks of common sense of how actually people think the world should work. Do you know what I mean? So there's this and why is that? Because at the heart of all this is a very, very simple idea, which is places should probably be owned, managed, and looked after by the people who live there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And the value that's created there should be recycled around there. Right? It's a very simple idea. And the moment you do that, anyone who was trying to maximize the financial take of it wouldn't have made this building, right? Yeah, they would not have made this. I always talk about in architecture, quality in architecture is measured not in pounds per square meter, but in hours of attention per square meter, right? Hours of love per square meter. This building has a very high hours of attention and hours of love per square meter, right? So, and you see this again and again, is that these places that flourish, these places that work. So for me, I'm kind of like, just remove the obviously stupid, perverse incentives. Right, just. So to go to your question, what are the actual things? What could that look like? And exactly as you said, there is no one correct answer here, right? The first thing is that we all at least see it. We have the honesty to say, this is the thing we're going to have to solve. Let's try all of the ways, right, to do. So there are ways around the planning system. We need the planning system with, I won't go geeky. The planning system was created, well, it evolved, but it was fundamentally, as we know, created in 1947. In one sense, what it did is it took away one of those rights, the development rights from landowners, but its kind of original sin is it left a lot of the land ownership rights otherwise intact. And the result is it's been locked into this relationship with land speculation ever since, right? So there are things around what we can do to give communities more power. Think whether it's things like community right to buy, but actually creating a more rules based. So actually systems, so developers can't then just negotiate their way out of stuff. So actually, if a community decide, no, we want that to be that kind of housing, that sets the land value low and it keeps the land value low, which allows the community to buy that piece of land, right? Because if people are speculating on that piece of land and its value is going up by millions and millions of pounds before anybody's done anything to it, right? So we need a planning system that can control that properly, which is always the job it was meant to do. It's not doing that job properly today, and we need to fix that. So planning's a way in, right? I'm increasingly obsessed. Obviously, yeah, things like Fairhold were very interesting. The reason we're interested in Fairhold, we didn't invent that model. We're just trying to standardize and normalize it. Because most people, if you hear, communities going to own the land, they go, it sounds a bit communist. Like, I don't want everyone to have to rent a home. And they don't realize, no, you can actually have a form of home ownership that you would probably prefer. And that can be completely made normal. So some of those standards and patterns to make that easier and more normal and more desirable. Because it's not enough to have people saying, I support that in principle. No. I want that for myself and for my family and for my neighborhood, right? So that's the thing. The thing that I don't know a lot about, but I'm learning a lot about at the moment. And Tim knows, because Tim and I have been emailing each other and I've been sending him completely long, weird stuff. Which is, I'm obsessed with it. How do we finance it? So what kind of new institutions are imagining the idea of a national community land bank? Mm-hmm. So in the model, things like green investment banks. So actually, when you look at the work you guys and We Can Make and others have been doing on retrofit, mm-hmm. a lot of it comes down to the moment communities could have access to 0% finance, all of this becomes possible very, very quickly. So, I'm like, where's an institution for that? What would be required to assemble a large-scale national institution whose purpose is to say, do you know what, we'll just move in and get that. And then even before the community have had time to organize, and then the moment the community organize, say, right, now you guys take control.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in those kind of institutions.
Because that's the problem as well, right? The cost of coordination and mobilizing, we cannot keep up with the market, right? Something comes up, we're trying to organize, there's 50 hurdles in the way before you can even get organized to take that. And then before you know it, it's gone. There is something later I do want to say, though, as well about the tactical in between, because there is plenty of money out there.
There's there's lots of things to be found in the cracks, but definitely there's a kind of a real need. And again, when we look back to history, we sort of did it with climate change. This is a controversial history, but the last time we as a nation wrote off a large form of essentially what you could call, unethical doesn't even touch it, deeply, deeply, deeply fundamentally flawed problematic property was the abolition of slavery, right? Now, actually, a lot, for better or for worse, it was controversial in a way that I don't think it is quite as controversial for land. We bought a large part of that out, and famously, we only finished paying off the bonds on that in 2014. That's not a bad mindset to think about this. You can think about this as effectively the future buying out the past. So if you as an individual can get a mortgage and be in debt to pay that off slowly, actually, why can't we create some financial mechanisms? And when you crunch the numbers, if you can make 0% finance available, by the way, we could buy out huge rafts of property in 20 to 30 years.
Yeah.
So it's very...
And especially if you also reform planning to enable communities to make the decision.
So when you start moving all these pieces together, a lot of the numbers don't start looking hopeless, right? It's very, very real. And just finally, and I promise I will shut up then, you touched exactly on this thing, which is the capacity, which is there is a complete missing level of governance in our country at the moment, which is we know how to talk and argue and do stuff at a national scale, and we relate to the individual. So you as an individual go and do your tax returns or whatever it is, right? But I think the scale of communities and the scale of neighborhood is the scale where the innovation is actually happening. But it's happening because you have these incredible, determined people like Jess, like Imi, like many of you here, who are fighting through a system that is fundamentally geared in the opposite direction and somehow managing to pull it off, right? That clearly isn't going to serve us. And as things start to collapse, we're going to need to learn how to build, support, and normalize that kind of institutional organizing at the scale of communities so it becomes much, much, much easier. And the key thing I would say is we need to be ready because stuff is going to start collapsing. It already is, right? Quicker and more suddenly. So, give a very, very niche example. One of the things we've talked about and written about is when you have a financial crisis like 2009, you can actually buy off distressed mortgages out of bank lenders. And actually the incentives work. They just want to ship them. They're actually quite happy to just get some liquidity back. But there needs to be organizations in place ready to do that. So the moment this hits, we need to be ready to be buying out those assets and buying out those land so that instead of then just reinflating the bubble and repeating the same old cycle, we can actually be then immediately helping people, rescuing people, protecting people, but then laying the foundations for the next model.
Absolutely. Thank you. We have got about 3 minutes each, 2.5 minutes each left before we have go into questions. So I just want to give each of you a chance to say the thing you have been wanting to say and haven't been able to say. Are we happy if we start with you, Nadia?
Yeah, that's fine. I feel like coming from a nature background and understanding that our biodiversity is just as important as like our built systems and how we to live and support one another. I do challenge, and I invite everybody to challenge the nature conservation sector as an industry and how it's this concept of barrier conservation and being able to tell people because it's like they have this really lovely way of presenting themselves where people are like, oh, that industry isn't that bad. But actually, ultimately, it's quite a misanthropic industry which believes that because you are not knowledge holders of our ecosystems, of our lichens, of our butterflies, of our mosses, amphibians, because you're not knowledge holders, they really aren't responsible enough to care for the country. Landowners and conservationists will tell the masses that alike that it's an irresponsible mass because you're not scientifically taught or you aren't a steward of the land and the land hasn't been in your history for 500 years. So actually, it is quite irresponsible to allow people to make decisions about ecosystems and nature. And actually what it needs is a load of people messily trying to figure out, build relationships with nature and go, oh, when I do this, that plant thrives. And over the next 2 seasons, I've noticed that didn't. And that's because we did this. That's the only way that we're going to heal our relationship with the land is through having the opportunity to be messy and dirty and get it wrong. Integrate healing our natural environment with our built environment and destroying this idea that we have to have a siloed land way of organizing, which is farming, nature, housing, and splitting it up. All of these things can live exactly together. Nightingales can put up with it really is true. We can and we can all kind of learn to be guardians of nature without somebody telling you that you have got to a level enough to be able to be a guardian of nature. And I think that that's really important.
Thank you. There's a real synergy with the way we think about culture here and how galleries that are intimidating and a bit snooty and like, this isn't for you, like no one can go into those. And if you feel scared or you're nervous and you're not sure you're allowed to be there, then you can't engage with the art and you can't imagine a future. And it feels to me very much the same with nature. Like if you don't feel you're not sure you're allowed and you're not really sure how, and you haven't got a safe place to land, then how do you start to do the next bit? So I think this is why the access bit is almost like the beginning of all of it. It's like us opening the doors here and helping people feel safe to come in. Like that's the
And then
beginning, right? And then they get used to it, and then they can engage with the art. Then they can be angry, and then they can be challenged, and then they can dream.
Yeah.
But you've got to make it safe to step in first.
There's an example of that. One of Scotland's biggest community land buyout, and why isn't it coming to my mind? Can anyone remind me that name? But they've got this huge moorland area, which like a lot of conservation organisations keep telling them, like, you need to look after the hen harriers. And they're like, let's figure it out. And they're like, but the numbers are going to decline if you don't manage it like this. And they're like, we're going to figure it out as a community. We don't want to lose golden eagles and hen harriers either, but we also want to let you tell us how to figure out what this land needs, because we live in it. We can see how the plants and the water. So yeah, it's great. Yeah.
Okay, Amy, you got 2 minutes.
I took a minute. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm just going to put off the back of what we were talking about, because it's like, I think often it's like, so what does it mean then to sit in the middle of all of these things? Because it's generational work. The work is generational. It took us hundreds and hundreds of years to get to this point. So the idea that we can try and do it in one project cycle, or we're going to build the National Community Bank for community land, or we're going to deal with, all of the restoring of biodiversity and moving through issues that took decades to get to this space, can be incredibly overwhelming. And so what I want to say is, like, I really enjoy being in the intersection of that long arc and what does it mean for someone to have a cup of tea and feel safe to come and sit down and have a chat in your space before we get there. And in the middle of all of that is what I think is important to also keep high levels of attention to detail to. And I do come from a sports background, so please excuse some of the comparisons, but like, we also have to be tactical. So amongst the 80-year journey, if you've got lucky, you maybe get to work 50 years of it in something that's really, really important, which I think I'm really lucky to do. In those moments, how do we tactically move to what's important? And so one of the things we've been doing more recently is just talking about how we can create systemic demonstrations of what could be possible. So when these moments come, there's more to point to, and there is the nexus between being able to feel and see and tangibly experience that in a way like you can when you walk in here, and how that meets like a story where Alastair's like, well, we could build a bank to do this over 20 years in that space. And it links back to that story of like, where do you find your bit in that? Because you might be the one making the cup of tea. Do pops to the community bank workshop and gives your thoughts and comes back and says, I'm really good here making that cup of tea. And I think that this is the thing that is often lost in these conversations about how do we do this then? And so the other thing I would say is it isn't just a generational piece of work to build the financial instruments to do this. There is also billions and billions and billions of pounds sat and piled up in the endowments of large foundations all over the country. And as a tactic, we've been trying to hack at that. And what I would say is it's been brutal, but what I can unequivocally say is, compared to 10 years ago, what's moving now and how it's moving, and some things I can't quite share yet and I haven't even told Jess yet. I was going to tell her over dinner tonight, that we'll share more of. I think we are getting closer to the large movement of money. And that is, it's only an interim. It can't do the things that Tim and Alastair are talking about. But what it can do is start to buy up the terrace block. It can do this, it can do that. It can start to build more East Quays. It can
show the art of the possible.
Yeah, and don't lose sight of that. But also, do not accept pennies. Do not accept scraps. Do not accept the power imbalance that sits where you are told what you can do. But also be ready
because when it moves, you also need to have the metaphorical bucket that it can move into, and just, you have to be ready for that. And if you're not ready for that, because everyone shouldn't be, because it's brutal and we're all exhausted, make sure that you're really beautifully attached to any anchors that can receive that, right? Because that is then how you can meet the moment tactically, be like, hold on, I already know what that town hall was going to be cost to buy. Get ready, have speculative things that you can be ready with. Because I do think alongside all of this, like you're seeing in the US, the philanthropic movement is now like, shit, to get the money out in different ways. These moments do come, and in COVID, it happened less than effectively. It happened in a panic emergency, and we could have done better, and we will next time.
Thank you, Imi. Please, a massive thank you to our panelists.